not everyone is going to have a blog or a book. And even if people are writing books, they might do it like every few years, or they might only write a couple of books in their life. And so podcasts seem like this great opportunity to get long form thoughts and get like inside the perspective of people who only really share like short form thoughts on like Twitter, because that's the nature of the medium, and maybe don't write books or don't write them often and don't have a blog or don't write those often. And so it seemed like an exciting new form of media. And I'd always reached out to people that I was interested in talking to. And so podcast gave me this default ask of, hey, do you want to come on the podcast? And it wouldn't just be a one-on-one conversation where something suddenly becomes something that's valuable to me and more valuable to the person because it's this recorded piece of media that they can share. And most importantly, just valuable to basically anyone.
Hello, friends. Welcome to another episode. Today's guest is Jake, who is the host of the Podcast of Jake and is also the creator of Base Colors, an interesting project that explores colors dynamics and blockchain in the Base network. We had a great discussion about his podcast, how he started it, why, and how to have some amazing interviews and conversations with very interesting people from the crypto and non crypto space. I hope you enjoyed this episode and remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Thank you for tuning in. Jake, thanks so much for joining today. How are you?
Great. Thank you for having me. I'm doing well and excited to be here. Appreciate you having me on.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure. I've been following your podcast for a while. Also, some of your projects like Base Colors, we'll talk about in a bit. You are a veteran in the podcast industry when it comes to the crypto world. When exactly did you start?
It's funny to hear you call me a veteran in the podcasting space because I certainly don't feel like one. I've been doing it for probably almost exactly 4 years now, maybe a month more than 4 years. I think I started in July or August of 2020. And I hadn't listened to that many podcasts at that point, but I was interested in having one of my own. And most of the reason was that, first of all, I always felt that Twitter and other forms of social media were pretty lacking in context and nuance due to the short form nature of them. And podcasting seemed to me like a great, just like a generally great medium for content on the internet that was new and different. For example, anyone can go on a podcast and share their thoughts in long form, but not everyone is going to have a blog or a book. And even if people are writing books, they might do it like every few years, or they might only write a couple of books in their life. And so podcasts seem like this great opportunity to get long form thoughts and get like inside the perspective of people who only really share like short form thoughts on like Twitter, because that's the nature of the medium, and maybe don't write books or don't write them often and don't have a blog or don't write those often. And so it seemed like an exciting new or relatively new sort of like form of media. And I'd always reached out to people that I was interested in talking to. And so podcast gave me this default ask of, hey, do you want to come on the podcast? And it wouldn't just be a one-on-one conversation where it was something that would be valuable to me and maybe to the person coming in if they found it valuable, but suddenly it becomes something that's valuable to me and more valuable to the person because it's this recorded piece of media that they can share. And most importantly, just valuable to basically anyone can listen from anywhere in the world at any time from the time it's published into basically the indefinite future. And so it just seemed like an interesting thing that really fit towards my interests. And I started it, and I basically reached out to these two guys in the longevity space, Aubrey DeGray and David Sinclair, who I was reading their work at the time, and invited them on a podcast that I didn't yet have. And Aubrey fortunately said yes. So I suddenly had a podcast, and I recorded the first episode with AirPods and spent the week between emailing him and scheduling it or whatever, preparing pretty intensely, and had a great conversation with Aubrey, and like off to the races from there. And now it's been, like I said, 4 years and 180 episodes or so, mostly like weekly or bi-weekly with some skips along the way, but pretty consistent over the years. And it's just this thing that I expect to do for the rest of my life, really, as well as blogging. Some years I might post 2 podcasts and 10 blogs, and other years I might post 50 podcasts and 4 blogs or whatever. But I like writing, and I like basically having people on the podcast, having these interesting conversations of the podcast variety. And yes, I expect to do them forever.
Yeah, no, that I can relate to that. Similar in my case, I also have a newsletter, right? A slash blog. and you told me you were writing at one point daily, right? So how does podcasting compares to blogging, Jake? Are there any similarities or any differences you think are one is harder than the other as a creator? What are your thoughts on writing versus podcasting?
Yeah, I think different people can do these two things in very different ways. For example, someone could spend next to no time preparing for a podcast, spend the hour on the podcast asking some questions, or maybe they even have like a set list of questions that they ask everyone that's the same. And so there's like really no work on prep or even really in the conversation on driving the conversation because it's a set list of questions or something like that that they ask the same for every guest. And then they might spend a ton of time on post production and creating clips and doing tweets and like all these various things. And if someone were to do that, would be like basically the polar opposite of my experience in podcasting. I spend a ton of time on prep. The conversation itself is challenging but rewarding and fun in that I am doing my best throughout the course of the conversation to drive it in directions that I think are interesting for the guest and therefore will be interesting for the audience because they're hearing the guest talk about things that they're genuinely interested in. And so, like, most of my work happens before the recording, and then the recording itself is a considerable challenge. And then afterwards, I'm like a lazy poster. I just don't really care to clip or do a big Twitter thing or whatever. It's just not the part that interests me. And if I put a lot of work into post production, editing, or clipping, or the tweet or anything like this, the overall activity, given that's like all of these pieces prep, recording, post production, clipping, tweeting, sharing, all these things like these are all pieces of this recurring habit, which is podcasting. And if I were to spend too much time of my total time that is required for this recurring activity in these tasks that I really don't enjoy. And actually, something like post production is almost like soul sucking to me. It's like this, it's just like a commoditized thing that like there's no reason I'm not going to be better at it than anyone else. And I just don't really care about it. So, like, I just really don't want to do it basically. And so I don't.
Yeah.
And maybe that has consequences on like sort of audience growth or something, whatever. The production, the editing thing, actually, I have a specific sort of thesis on, which is that Joe Rogan doesn't really edit his podcasts. They're like pretty raw, at least he's not doing a
Mhm.
lot of editing because you could see the video and it's just not. And if he was able to build the world's best podcast, most listened to podcast without editing, then I think anyone who says that sort of editing is like a prerequisite for having a great podcast is fooling themselves. And so, I cut these parts of the process that I don't like and focus on the parts that I do. And as a result of that, the overall process of podcasting is super enjoyable for me. So I don't know that like any parts of it, I would say the recording itself is probably the hardest part because it's time restricted and it's like a performance for lack of a better word, and you can
Mhm.
do better or you can do worse. A performance more so in terms of playing a sport than like acting. It's not acting, but it's like you can perform better or worse in the
Mhm.
game basically. And so that's probably the hardest part.
Yeah.
And then the preparation is just the part that I really enjoy. And writing is just like I said, there's very different ways you could do a podcast. There's very different ways you could write. So some people could do heavily research for a very long time to come out with this 2-page post. And I've done stuff like that before, but the vast majority of my writing for the blog is more so like just things that I'm thinking about and just writing authentically. And I'm not really usually like citing a bunch of sources for things or trying to make this like super formal style of writing or constraining myself even to a particular topic. I just basically write when I'm inspired to write about something. If it's an idea that feels like there's more to it than can be fit in a short tweet, then it's something that I might like to write about. I don't know that I have the hardest part of that necessarily, but in general, writing is just hard. And I guess I make it a little bit easier for myself by just writing in a way that I feel good about, that is interesting to me. And sometimes I'll write sentences even that I know will be like hard to understand, but they sound nice to me and I like the way that they're written. And so if I try to write first and foremost for myself, then a lot of care about what would be the best way to write this for an audience to like it or something goes away. And so that makes it a little bit easier as well.
Yeah, basically you do it for fun. You focus on the things you enjoy, and then like post production, you mentioned it's soul sucking, right? It's very yeah, it's an agony. I understand the feeling. Jake, there are two things that I think stand out. What your podcast is known for. One is great guests. You had some amazing guests over the years, and you mentioned your prep work. I think it's also the consistency, right? You have been doing it for for multiple years. You're about to cross 200 episodes soon. So, what are your tips to get great guests and keep doing it over a long period of time? Anything in particular comes to mind? Hello, guys. I just wanted to take some time to remind you about my NFT subscription via Hypersub. All subscribers get access to my token gated newsletter articles. You also get the podcast episodes airdropped into your crypto wallet. 8% of the revenue is shared across all subscribers. You also get access to my Discord server and participate in monthly giveaways and allow list opportunities. You can cancel at any time, and also you can control the length. You can go on a month to month basis, or you can get a whole year at once. This is also how I can keep going with the newsletter and podcast, and your support really means a lot. Find the link in the show notes below, and you can always DM me through my social networks if you have any questions. Thanks for your support.
Yeah, I think there's a few things. So one is, I guess it starts with a desire to have great guests. You can count yourself out from the beginning or rule yourself out from any possibility of getting great guests by starting with a faulty assumption that you're not going to be able to get any great guests or that you're not good enough yet to handle a conversation with a great guest. And these are things that I've heard from people directly. So these are thoughts that exist with certain podcast hosts. I don't know if I'm ready to interview so and so yet or something like that. But you'll never be ready. So you have to actually do it. And that's the way that you get ready and can do more of it. And first of all, it's like going for it. And then like, how do you go for it? I think there's not really a secret, at least for me and my way that I get guests, as much as it is just doing the work. And that work consists of reaching out to people cold, which I guess is another difference between me and perhaps some others is that 95% of my guests probably have been cold outreach, with the other 5% being like inbound, like someone reached out as they wanted to be a guest. And so I don't ask for, hey, can you introduce me to so and so? I'd love to have them on as a guest. It's just not something that I do. I feel like it imposes a favor on the person you're asking. You're basically asking them to put some of like their social reputation on the line and make this ask. You're making an ask to them to make an ask. And I just am not a big fan of that. I think and then why do it? Because there's this idea that a warm intro is more likely to get a yes than a cold intro. But it's to me, if the warm intro is the thing that is moving the needle between a yes or a no from the person you're trying to get to, then I don't really want to even have that conversation because I only want to have the conversation if the guest actually wants to be there. And if they're doing it as a favor to their friend because I asked their friend for the intro, then it's not going to be a great conversation, probably. I should be able to convince the person to come on the show on my own merit without needing to borrow from someone else's like friendship with them or whatever and just impose this ask on a former guest of mine or a friend or whatever it is. Believing that you can get great guests, understanding that going cold from my perspective is the move, and then doing it in volume and persistent over time. And so I don't think I have some magic cold email. I mean, I follow some basic principles such as keeping it very short. Most people are pretty surprised by how short my cold emails are. They tend to be fewer characters than the maximum character count in like a tweet. So very short, 3 sentences at most, probably. Maybe not at most, but 3 sentences on average, probably. And you have to get people interested. People send emails with the assumption oftentimes that they're going to get read. And I think anything that comes after that assumption is basically built upon a false assumption. I think you should assume that your email will not be read. And so you have to quickly create a reason for the person you're sending it to actually read it. And then, you can get to, you know, actually trying to get your message across or whatever. So, and then the most important part, I think, besides the content of the message, which I said I actually don't think I have any sort of like secret sauce for or whatever, is actually just sending a lot of these emails. So I get a ton of people who don't respond. And I invite them on the podcast, they never respond. And I get some no's, but they're relatively far and few between. The no's actually are like these welcomed responses because, first of all, they're responses. And second of all, they tend to be like very kind and like thoughtful as to why it's a no or something. But then, of course, I get a lot of yeses. And you can see who that is from looking at the guest list over the years. And I think there's this sort of like false notion that sending like cold emails could be like perceived as annoying. And I think it certainly can be. So there's this guy who's been emailing me for the last 3 weeks, like every 2 or 3 days, trying to get this person. He's like from some agency trying to get a guest on my podcast. And like from the get go, I wasn't interested. And then he like keeps sending emails of like basically no difference from like the original one, like just these small like little differences or whatever. I'm not really reading them, so I don't know. But he's like pushing for this like guest. And then like the most recent one was like, okay, I understand you don't want to hear about this guest, but here's another one. And I'm just like, dude, stop emailing. Like I didn't respond because that just makes the problem worse. But stop emailing me. This is ridiculous. Like you email me every 3 days. This is annoying. Just simply because I have to see an email and click delete like every 3 days. It's just imposing your like, I don't know, it's not good.
Yeah.
But beyond like that extreme and like sufficiently far away from that, there's this other form of persistence, which is sending an email, cold email, inviting someone on the podcast, and them not responding. And 6 months or a year later, you hear them speak on another podcast, and you're like, oh man, like I really do want to have that person on. And so you send another follow up that's, hey, I just listened to you on this episode and just want to follow up on my previous invite. Like maybe that wasn't a good time, but would love to have you on the podcast if you're up for it. And that's like a respectful human one-of-one follow-up that happens 6 months or a year and a half later. Like I sent follow-up emails that had 2 or 3 years between the prior email and the one that I sent. So as long as you're like being persistent in a way that is respectful and genuine, I think people vastly overestimate how often that would be perceived as annoying. I think it's very rarely perceived as annoying. And I know this to some degree because when I started my career, I was working in investment banking and known that cold emailing analysts and associates is like the way to get your foot in the door. So I would see these
Mhm.
different people, have these different sort of approaches to follow up and just like the difference between good cold emails and bad cold emails. And so I know what it's like from the other side. And I've since dealt with like inbound podcast guest requests, like I mentioned, or whatever. So seeing cold emails come your way, like really helps to put yourself in the recipient's shoes. And there is a way to email people who you've never met before multiple times over what should be probably like a longer period of time in a way that is not only not annoying, but is actually like very respectable. And I've had people respond to my emails and say, first thing they say is after not responding to 3 emails over 3 years, they'll respond to the fourth or something. And they'll say, I appreciate your persistence and I'm happy to come on the show or something like that. And
Yeah.
so it's just about doing it the right way, but shooting your shot, doing it a lot and being persistent and don't send like a super long cold email that they're just not even going to read. And no guests, don't consider any guest to be beyond your reach. Go for it. So that's
Yeah.
like the long version of it.
Yeah, it's you have to be thoughtfully persistent.
Yeah.
And what you mentioned that maybe after 6 months or after a year, you try again. That shows that you really want to have this person in the podcast, and that you also have been in a way polite and respecting their attention and their time. So yeah, that's great. That's something I'll use, Jake. Thanks for the tip. And for you, Jake, when do you usually, when you finish recording, when do you usually say, wow, this was a great conversation? Is there anything in particular across the years, across your almost 200 episodes, that you can identify, okay, this conversation was great? What are those elements? Do you have that in mind or not really?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's hard to describe the why,
Mm.
but I do, after each recording, have a sense of how I felt that it went. And one interesting observation I've made over the years is that when I'm like, sometimes I finish an episode with a great guest that I spend an abnormal amount of time preparing for, was really excited about it. And I just felt like I just crushed it. Like I just drove the conversation exactly in the right directions and really had the opportunity to use a lot of these sort of like details that I discovered in my prep work because I have like this detailed like sort of prep sheet, but yet it's not like a scripted conversation. So I don't know in a given conversation if an interesting direction comes up that takes us away from some of the stuff that I had prepared, that can be the right direction to go into. And yet I'll feel like a little bad after maybe because it's like, that was really interesting, but like all this prep, I didn't really use this. And so anyway, this right combination of things happens. And I just feel like, man, that was great. And it feels so good. And then conversely, on the other side of things, sometimes I just didn't really have the energy today. Something like wasn't quite right. Like just wasn't a great conversation. It's not totally on me. Like the guest can really make or break a conversation if I'm someone who has like different amounts of energy for talking with people on given days and are just like I don't know, being a host basically. And so some days like I don't really have the energy and the guest comes with this tremendous positive energy. Like they want to be there, they want to be interesting, they want to be engaging and record a great conversation. And like that can totally pick me up and we can have an absolutely great episode. And then conversely, like I can come in pretty good shape, like feel really good about my prep and I'm really excited for the conversation. And once in a while, it has been very rare for me, fortunately, but once in a while the guest comes in, they feel like they're just like you're just the next meeting on their schedule and it's like they don't really care to make things
Mhm.
interesting at all or whatever. And like I said, fortunately I have very few cases of that. But for whatever reason, once in every, I don't know, 20 episodes or 25 episodes, 30 episodes, something like that, I get off one, I'm like, like felt like a little bit of a clunker. And what's been funny is like these, and the vast majority of them I finish on, I feel good about them, but they're not like, wow, that was like absolutely crushed it, or oh, that was a clunker. Both of those
Yeah.
situations are like more rare. And what's been interesting is I find that when I listen to those back, the ones that I felt went really poorly, they're never as bad as I thought immediately after the fact. And then the ones that I
Yeah.
felt were amazing, I listened to after and I'm like it was really good, but I don't know if it was that much of a standout from like some of the other ones. So everything's reversed to the mean in a way.
Yeah, same here. Same here. Sometimes I finish episodes and I don't feel so good about it. And sometimes the opposite, that this was really smooth. But then what happens is it doesn't translate to the feedback from people or also the numbers, right, in terms of
Hmm.
listeners. So it's very hard to measure these things, right? And sometimes some episodes, there are some clips and people start watching those after some time. So yeah, I now what I do after recording, I just don't really think about it. I come back later and after publishing, I maybe listen to it, I'm editing it, but I don't, you never know what will happen once you publish it. But of course, there is energy. There are some guests that are really good at talking and are very straight to the point. And I think that's also, I don't really do this, to be honest, Jake, but some podcasters, they try to bring guests that are like great at talking, even if they don't have a great project or something in particular
Hmm.
that they are known for, but they are great talkers. They are great
Hmm.
at speaking. And that makes the podcast much better, and the work of the host, I think, a little bit easier as well.
Yeah.
And how do you usually pick guests, Jake? I think recently you have been in the cutting edge, trying to get guests that are the cutting edge of building on crypto, building in the blockchain. So, what's usually the process? And maybe it has changed over time, but your process right now, let's say over the past months, is there anything in particular you're interested in or that you're looking for?
Yeah. I would say there's probably two interesting. Let me just say something quickly, actually, which is that you just mentioned in your last point that like some of these great guests, they like get right to the point. And as you're saying that, I'm like feeling bad that I'm not the kind of person who like gets right to the point. I go all these tangents.
That's not necessarily going straight to the point, is not necessarily like being a
The
great
best.
speaker. Yeah,
Right.
because
Right.
also, like in my case, it depends how, if it's a 1 hour 2 hours conversation, I think it's great to go into all the details, right? Sometimes it's even hard, right, to, because then you have to, as a host, you have to keep, you know finding more themes and topics. But no, I
Right.
didn't say it because of you, Jacob. You're one of
No,
the
no,
best
no. I know.
conversationalists.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I appreciate that. So anyway, on the question, I'll try to get right to the point on this one just for fun. But you asked basically what are the things that I look for in guests. I would say I have two important criteria and one important thing that I don't have as a criteria that I would say most people do. So like equally important as a non-criteria. So I'll start with the non-criteria. That is that I do not have a particular like niche. Like this isn't Pod of Jake is not like a crypto podcast or a longevity podcast or something else. And that's part of why I think it's nice. Like it's just named after me. It's like the Joe Rogan podcast isn't any particular niche. He has a lot of comedians on and he has a lot of fighters on, UFC guys or whatever, but it's not a UFC podcast. And from day one, I wanted mine to be a reflection of all of my interests, not just one particular sort of niche area of my interest, despite the fact that I acknowledge that operating within a niche is probably the better way to build a large following on the internet more quickly. I think, and I'm not doing it primarily for the audience growth, so it's fine. It's a price well worth paying to be able to talk to anyone I want to talk to and not feel constrained to a particular niche or a particular category. So that's like the non-criteria that most people from the beginning, it's not even a consideration to have them on the podcast if they're not within the category. For me, anyone is viable to be a podcast guest from the beginning. It could be someone in crypto, yes. Like most of my guests do end up being like founder or investor types. A lot of them are in crypto. Probably at least half of my guests have been somewhat involved with crypto. Like last winter, I had a couple of basketball coaches on the podcast, like a high school basketball coach, the coach of Yale, who Yale ended up making a really good run actually, and college basketball last year. I love that about it, that I can reach out to anyone I'm interested in and there's no constraint in terms of who they are or what they do. So that's like the non-criteria. And then the two criteria that I do hold myself to are related to it's a non-negotiable that I have to be like very genuinely interested in talking with this person. So that means if I get an inbound guest who seems like a good person, but I just don't really have that genuine interest, that's going to be a no for me. I'm not going to reach out to people who I'm not genuinely interested in. So that's sort of like a big one. And again, like a non-negotiable. And the other one layered on top of that, which I have probably deprioritized more so in the last 6 months or so than any time before is a prominence threshold. So you can think of it as like an interest threshold and a prominence threshold. And the interest threshold is non-negotiable. They have to be like above this certain level of interestingness to me. Otherwise, I just don't think it's going to go very well, basically. And it's like, what am I doing if I'm having people on I'm not interested in? Like, why am I even doing it? It would have to be
Right.
like for an audience reason, and that's just not what I want to do. And
Mhm.
then on the prominence side, it's roughly analogous to like what's their Twitter following, or maybe if they're not on Twitter, like how well known are they in whatever space that they're operating in, or whatever. And in the beginning, I wanted to keep like a very high bar for this because my sort of thesis for how the podcast would grow over time was that I would basically get a slice of every guest. I'd record the episode, the guest, I would share it, the guest would share it, a slice of their
Mhm.
audience, which was much bigger than mine, would tune in. A slice of that slice would then say, okay, wow, that was great. I want to listen to more of this guy's podcast. So they subscribe. And that to me was like this repeatable compounding equation for growth that could work over a long period of time. Hasn't really played out exactly that way, which is fine. But basically, I thought if I did that, then over time I could lower this prominence threshold, which like it's limiting. There's a larger universe of people who I'm genuinely interested in than there is when you add on the prominence threshold to that genuinely interested sort of universe. And so I thought that I could like lower that threshold over time or even remove it completely if and when I had sufficiently large audience of my own, and then I could spend more time taking this spotlight or this stage that I've earned for myself and
Mhm.
shining the spotlight on lesser discovered people. Like that was a really exciting, like long-term thing for me. And what I realized like 6 months ago or so, after 3.5 years of like really no noticeable growth, like in the beginning, I got fortunate, like with some episodes, they took off, had thousands of views. But since then, I haven't really like, most of my episodes still get hundreds of views. Occasionally, some of the better ones get thousands. And that's like pretty much it. There's no, if you look at the long term chart, there's no like huge growth or anything. And so I'm like, this sort of building a stage for myself thing with this prominence threshold hasn't really been working. And I'm still going to be interested in talking with like prominent people who are interesting to me, but maybe I can take my foot off the gas a little bit on this prominence threshold. And if I'm going to wait until I have a sufficiently large audience to quote unquote shine the spotlight on lesser discovered people, I can just start doing that now. I have, it's the level that audience has to be in order for the spotlight to be meaningful is somewhat arbitrary anyway. It's at what point is it big enough to make a difference? Who knows? Like I already have, of the audience that I do have, they're such high quality people. Like I'm
Mhm.
always surprised by it that you don't need thousands or hundreds of thousands of people to listen to this person who I'm trying to like give some more attention. You can have one really good person who listens to my podcast, discovers this person they didn't know before, and maybe they connect, and that makes like a material difference in the lesser discovered person's life or something like that. I started to worry a little bit less about that. And now I'm just talking to people I'm genuinely interested in. But to be fair, I definitely still try to sprinkle enough. Like I try to have the prominence threshold like often enough, high enough that people
Hmm.
who stumble upon my podcast for the first time will look at the guest list, and if they have like a shared set of interests of mine, or at least they overlap on like the Venn diagram, like maybe they don't care at all about basketball, but they like crypto and longevity, they'll see enough names that they're like, oh, this is a podcast that I should subscribe to, because you have to get someone to be interested before listening to some extent. And so that's like a part of it as well. So I definitely keep audience growth in mind, but it's just not the primary focus. And so I have this kind of nuanced approach as a result of that.
Yeah, I think it's a delicate line. I also think about this, but I feel like the way how you do it, you are doing this for fun. You have been doing it for over 3 years, and I think that's really important. What you said that's non-negotiable is that you have to be genuinely interested in the person you are going to talk to. And yeah, the way how you deal with the inbound requests, all that, it sounds really familiar. But I think that that makes sense. And again, I think we mentioned this, but in crypto, we are still, people think of crypto as a huge, like there were millions of people usually interacting with crypto and in the applications in terms of users, or also in terms of the podcast, how many listeners they are. But crypto is still a relatively small, let's say, audience size. It's
Yeah.
so for a podcast to have millions of listeners in this industry is really hard. And I think that's why we shouldn't, when people compare numbers to shows that are established, maybe they have been doing it for 5, 10 years. It's really not like it's comparing apples to pears, right? They say. More talking about more recent things, Jake, you have been on Forecaster. I think we connected there recently, and you had some great guests from that ecosystem, but also from the base ecosystem. And you have been building your own project, Base Colors, which I have collected some of the colors, but I would like to hear from you. What's Base Colors for those that haven't seen it?
Yeah, it's so nice to hear you like say base colors. It's a silly thing, but when people say the word, like I've been on a few podcasts at this point, or just talking with people not recorded or whatever. I've heard enough people say it, and I love hearing it every time. I don't know. I think it's a sign of a good name that literally every time I hear someone say it, I love it. And you've got your like unique accent, so it sounds like particularly interesting when you say it. But yeah, I appreciate it, and I think if I give the as like fundamental of a description as I can, and we could plug into any elements that are interesting. But fundamentally, it is what you can think about as like sort of an NFT collection. And I'm hesitant about like using the word NFT, like a weird term these
Yeah.
days in terms of it comes with a lot of baggage. But fundamentally, it is a non-fungible token collection, which means that it's these collectible tokens, but each one is genuinely different than another. Whereas Bitcoin is fungible, one Bitcoin equals one Bitcoin. They're all the same and indistinguishable from one another. So this is a non-fungible collection, and the way in which it is non-fungible is that every token is representative of a different color. And that sort of color can be expressed, in two ways. One is visually looking at it, you will see a color. You're familiar with NFT, obviously you are, but the audience or whatever is, familiar with NFTs to some extent, maybe where it involves like an image. And in this case, the image is just a color. Whatever format you're viewing the art in, it's going to basically show as a sort of like a color square or a color tile if the corners are rounded, whatever sort of interface you're looking at. And it's just a color. There's no picture of a monkey or whatever else. It's just a color. And that's one way to look at it. Another way is that the title or the name of the token is going to be the hex code. That's going to be like hashtag 0000F is the hex code for my profile picture, which is like a pure blue, for example. And so the way that the collection works is that there's actually one of one color for every color in the RGB model, which is the basically universal standard for digital colors. So I shorthand to talk about the collection is the NFT collection for every color on the internet. And so this RGB model has 16,777,216 hex codes. So in addition to
Wow.
0000FF, there's FFFF00 and FF0000 and 123 and et cetera, et cetera. There's basically for each of those 6 digits, every hex code is 6 digits, and for each of those 6 digits, there's 16 possible values, any number
Yeah.
between 0 and 9, and any letter between A and F. And you can think of A through F as representing the numbers 10 through 15. So it's like this, it's not sort of, it is this hexadecimal system. So we're used to like the decimal system, there's 0 to 10 base. This is the hexadecimal system with 16 values, and it's basically 0 through the number 15, with 10 through 15 being represented by letters instead of numbers. And it's this huge collection of very objectively non-fungible, unique colors, and anyone can buy them. They are available to mint on basecolors.com for roughly $2.50 right now, but it's set in the price of Ethereum, so it's 0.001 Ethereum. And the other sort of unique thing is that you can give each color, as the owner of the NFT, you can give it a name, like you can name the color, and so it's this like owner modifiable trait, where if you look at like the Bored Apes collection or something, on OpenSea, they might have a trait for cool glasses or whatever, a cigar or something. Base Colors has a trait called the color name, and it's something that the owner can change at any time to any name that is not already taken in the Base Colors naming system. So every name, in addition to the color and the hex code, every name is also unique. So you have a few different elements of uniqueness. And so basically it's buying colors, naming colors. And I think it's a really fun and easy way for people to onboard their non-crypto friends on chain. And then for within crypto, I think there's a ton of, for crypto natives, I think there's a ton of really interesting things that can be done here. Colors are such a fundamental piece of art, which is really what NFTs have been all about from the start. And
Mm.
if you have every color on chain with an owner and a name, there's just so many things that can be done with that. And we've already had projects from NFT collections to games to apps that have integrated base colors. Anyone building on base, basically, it could make some
Mm.
sense to integrate base colors in some way, whether that's customizing the UI of their app, allowing users to change the colors on their app to any of the base colors that they own, or in an NFT collection, you can have the base colors incorporated into a particular piece of art can be listed as traits with their color names. And so that could
Mm.
be like an interesting element. It's just like, why would you use generic colors when you can use colors that are on chain in the environment and the ecosystem that you're building within, basically? And maybe there's decent arguments for that, but I think for a lot of projects, it makes a lot of sense. And so it's like the most interoperable NFT collection I think possible. And at the same time, colors are really the most fundamental element of art from my perspective. You could maybe make an argument for lines or for shapes or something like this, but there's infinite numbers of types of lines and shapes. And it just so happens that we have this existing universe, this existing collection really of colors that is non-arbitrary. There is a fixed number of digital colors, and we're bringing them all on chain, and we're giving them owners, and we're giving them names. And so that's a little bit of a
Yeah.
long intro, but that's the gist of the
No,
project.
that's the project right there. That's a great way to put it. I have two colors. I think I have the one from the Blind Gallery, which is the digital gallery that that I founded, and I have another one, a blue. I think it's from my PFP, the blue from my
Mm.
PFP. I have those two. And Jake, why did you decide to put this project on Base? What did you see on Base? What have you seen recently in this L2 that grabbed your attention?
Yeah, I think building on any blockchain comes with a considerable amount of risk. Even building on Ethereum is probably the least risky thing that you could do. And even Ethereum is not guaranteed to succeed. Solana could flip it as like this useful blockchain for a lot of use cases and apps, and Ethereum could fade into irrelevance or something. I'm not saying I think that's going to happen. I don't think that's going to happen. If I thought that was going to happen, I'd be building soul colors instead of base colors. But it's just worth being aware of the risk. And I always, before I was building in crypto directly, as I was just like interviewing folks for the podcast, I always respected these founders who um, were taking that risk and willing to basically write it off, because you can't be operating on something that has its own tremendous risk. Like any startup has high probability of failing, or any project really. And you're then putting that risk on top of a base layer risk of
Hmm.
the entire system that I'm building upon is at risk of failing. So there's always going to be risk, but I think that base became clear to me as the best sort of ecosystem, or L2 or whatever you want to define it as, to build on for a number of reasons. Ultimately, it's probably just a gut feel, but there's a lot of logic behind it. One is that, like I said, I think Bitcoin is the power law winner within crypto, but below that, Ethereum is the power law winner among the rest of crypto. And Bitcoin, I think, to me is, yeah, there people are doing like ordinals or whatever. There's these like people are trying to make, and there's Lightning Network. Like people are trying to make Bitcoin more useful in the way that like sort of
Hmm.
Ethereum is. But I still view it as digital gold, and I think its most likely outcome is that it becomes this pure store of value, pure like money sort of thing. And so beyond that, I think Ethereum is the power law winner for everything else in crypto. And sure, Solana might come up and be more useful for certain things like gaming or whatever it might be, or maybe they're doing mostly the same things, but one is just bigger than another, or whatever it is. I
Hmm.
don't know. But I think Ethereum is a comfortable bet at this point, or a reasonably strong bet to be like the power law winning L1 beyond Bitcoin for actually doing like useful things besides just store value. And then within Ethereum, it seems pretty clear that L2s are the way that things are headed for actually like processing the vast majority of what's going on. I would never have built base colors on Ethereum L1 because it just would have been impractical. It's because
The
of the
gas fees.
supply.
Yeah.
Yeah, because of the supply
Right.
of 16 million, you needed to have a low mint price. And with a low mint price, it doesn't make any sense to do it on Ethereum where gas fees are high, like you said, and the gas fees would be higher than the mint price. And it just doesn't make any sense. So in a way, we actually couldn't have built base colors without
Hmm.
base. And we could have done it on a different L2 maybe, or Solana, like I mentioned. But a low fee blockchain is a prerequisite for this collection of every colors concept. And it's interesting because like I had this idea 2 or 3 years ago, and at that time, like it might have seemed viable because like NFTs were super hot and it seemed like everything could work or whatever. But if I really thought about it, it just never made sense. It would have never made sense to do it on Ethereum or a higher fee blockchain. And so it's good that sort of I waited, and the timing now feels perfect in ways that are a whole nother sort of conversation. So I explained why Ethereum and then why Base. Again, I think it's reasonable to have a lot of confidence that Base is going to be like the power law winning L2 on Ethereum. Part of that is because it's Coinbase backed, and Coinbase is one of, if not the biggest companies in the world in crypto. Have companies like Amazon, for example, tried to launch a phone and failed miserably with the force of Amazon behind it and the resources of Amazon behind it. You had even Coinbase itself actually tried to launch this like
Yeah.
platform. I forget what
Marketplace.
it was. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That was a year or two ago, and that sort of fizzled out. So just having the backing of Coinbase as an L2 certainly wasn't enough that it would make it inevitably successful. But I've been fortunate to be able to watch it for now like a year since it launched. And at the time when I was deciding to build base colors on it, it was more like, I don't know, 6 or 8 months. And I've seen that the moment, first of all, I just love like the culture. Jesse's doing an amazing job at the helm, and the whole team just seems to be crushing it. The builders who are building on Base are great. And it just, if you look at the various metrics that are important for tracking the success of an L2 or a blockchain in general, Base is at least arguably the leader already by several metrics, and top two or three by others. And it seems that it's been able to attain that position that I would say is already a leadership position within its first year. That's substantially faster progress and momentum than any other L2 has had to date. And so I feel like if you just track the trend lines, Base is poised to be extremely successful relative to all other L2s. And Farcaster would be another example of a good metric. Like Base is the dominant chain on which people on Farcaster are transacting on. And I'm spending a lot of time on Farcaster, and in a way with our sort of like distribution strategy for Base Colors and just like where I'm spending my time writing about it and stuff, it's like largely Farcaster focused. It's definitely Farcaster first. In a way, we're betting on Base and we're betting on Farcaster, and those two are like very much attached at the hip right now. And I'm very bullish that they can both grow tremendously in the context of Ethereum continuing to be dominant and growing a lot in terms of like its own market cap and user base and everything like this. And so if I attach myself to that three-headed thing and I'm able to establish as one of the more interesting collections and really like a one-of-one primitive of colors on Base, that and we can grow with these ecosystems, then I think that's a great position to be in. So it's like early enough that it's still substantially risky to be betting on Base, to be betting on Farcaster and things like this, but these are bets that I feel as strongly as I could about, given how early that they are. And so I think obviously we have our own work to do, that we need to stand out within those ecosystems because they're early, but they're not tiny. Like it's not trivial to be the best NFT collection on Farcaster or the best NFT collection in Base Colors or whatever it might be. But at the very least, I think so far we've established ourselves as the color collection on Base. I think if someone else were to try to do that at this point, it would be like, what are you doing? Like they already did that.
Yeah.
Like it's literally called Base Colors. And so I feel good about our launch and early traction. The right people are seeing interesting things in this, a lot of which I see and some of which I didn't even really think about. And so it's really high quality people who are liking the project, which I love to see. It's not like a bunch of bots or whatever, like chasing a quick buck. Or the project aligns itself very well towards being this like longer term thing, because you can't just go flip colors because it's not
Yeah.
going to mint out for a very long time. So people who are getting involved, like they genuinely like it. Like they just want a color. They want to buy a color. They want to name a color. They like thinking about this. It seems interesting and different and new and fundamental, and it's on Base. And for all of these reasons, I think it's just been a pretty good start. So that's the gist of, I guess, why we're building on Base.
Anybody listening wants to buy their base color. What's the URL, Jake?
It's basecolors.com.
Okay. And how many mints so far? You mentioned there were millions of colors, right? So how many mints so far?
Yeah, so far we've got 22,000 or so. It's a good start. And like I said, this inevitably has to be a longer term thing. And I think if you look at the most successful projects within crypto, a lot of them, like CryptoPunks comes to mind as an example, they weren't like super hyped or popular in the beginning. It took actually like years for them to become appropriately appreciated. And I think Base Colors, because of the supply, it has to be that way as well. I don't know what the exact time frame is, but it's just there's certain pieces that are going to take a long time to be either realized or be implemented. And it's growing with Base, which is still very early. It's growing with Farcaster, which is still very early. Like I said, my focus is on establishing ourselves as one of the best and most interesting projects in both of those ecosystems, Base and Farcaster, and then continuing to grow with and alongside them. And it's also one of the best things about Base Colors is we can collaborate basically with everyone, certainly everyone building on Base. And that's not the case for a lot of projects in crypto. A lot of cases, you're going to be competitive with a lot of the space or just irrelevant for most of the space. A decentralized exchange trying to start up on Base is going to be competitive with Aerodrome
Mm.
and just not really that relevant for a lot of other projects. Whereas Base Colors, like there's colors everywhere. There's colors in the UI of your favorite apps. There's colors in the art of your favorite NFT collections. It really feels like more of a primitive. And so I can reach out to anyone I want to, maybe borrow some of those tips and tricks from the podcast outreach approach and reach out to anyone building in the Base ecosystem and try to do cool things together. And so I guess we've
Yeah.
had some early examples that works. I met a friend, now he's a friend, his name's Apex. I think it's apex777.eth. I forget his exact thing on Farcaster, but you can find him there, or on Twitter. I think it might be Apex Deployer. he's built some really cool NFT collections, and he had this sort of signature thing that he did with the art is determined in a lot of ways by your Ethereum address itself. And there was this really interesting collaboration that I saw possible between us where the Ethereum address is actually comprised of the same hexadecimal digits that hex codes, like the colors, are comprised of. And so you can cut the Ethereum address into segments of 6 and actually get hex
Mm.
codes out of that. And so like the Ethereum address can be converted
Into three
into,
colors,
yeah, 7 colors really. It's like
7 colors.
42
Okay.
characters. And so that's really cool. So basically Apex, who already had this signature of building with the Ethereum address, and myself coming from this base colors background, we basically collaborated on like this thing where it's called soul bounds. And basically any wallet can mint at most one soul bound, which is representative of their Ethereum address. And it's basically this 7 bar image with 7 different colors. And then in the traits, like if you look at it on OpenSea, the colors are shown as the colors that are included in your soulbound are shown as traits. And if you or someone else has minted those base colors and given them names, then like those names will show up in the traits. So you might want to, for example, buy the 7 colors that are a part of your soulbound so that you can name and have those like in the traits of your soulbound. And then
Mm.
Apex himself actually had this weird sort of thing where one of the colors in his actual address was already taken, so he couldn't go get it, and someone had already named it. So he had this trait that wasn't within his control, but someone had bought and named the base color. So it's like this really sensible collaboration. And I don't want to just do like collaborations for the sake of doing collaborations. Like anyone can build what they want with base colors. That's the beauty of crypto. But as far as stuff that I'm like actively involved in, I want to do collaborations where they really make a lot of sense and can be done in a way that feels genuine and like sincere from the artist or from the builder who's on the other side of the collaboration. So there's just a ton to do. But like I said, I think 22,000 minted so far. And that Soulbounds project that I mentioned did another 11,000 or so minted at the same price point of 0.001 ETH so far in just a sort of a couple months post launch. A lot of reasons to be optimistic, and anecdotally, like I said, a lot of interesting sort of comments from the community, especially on Farcaster. So I'm having a ton of fun and plan to keep working on it really hard.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it clearly, like the synergies, right? There are many options, there are many possibilities with with base colors, with colors in general. And yeah, base seems to be the right place at the moment for this kind of consumer use cases and experiences, right? And there are different reasons why, but I think that's the right place for something like this to happen. And I think you're right. You need to push some of these collaborations right early on, and then as people see the project, they start to see base colors around. They will like to do it by themselves, right? And this should come naturally and organically. But yeah, congratulations, Jake. It's a very interesting project. I'll check what you mentioned about my wallet and the 7 colors from my wallet. I will take a look at that. But I would like to ask you, Jake, before we close the episode, as somebody that you are a podcaster, you are reading a lot of things, you are consuming a lot of content, and you had over close to 200 conversations over the past 3 years with people in the space and some people that are not necessarily in crypto. But what are 3 recommendations, Jake, in terms of could be a podcast, could be a publication, could be an account, a project, 3 recommendations for listeners that you think people should get into?
Yeah, I will, if it's okay with you, organize this actually by Farcaster channels because there's like these
Yeah.
interests within Farcaster
Hmm.
ecosystem. I think one channel that people should take a look at and see if there's ways that they can use it is actually the Bounties channel, where there's a company called Bountycaster that is building this sort of ecosystem for people to assign and complete tasks of various kinds. And it's actually been really useful in the early days of building base colors. I put some things that I don't feel the need to do internally with ourselves, put out there as bounties. And so that's a sort of an interesting channel I recommend people check out. I've been having a ton of fun in the higher channel. People on Farcaster may or may not
Mm.
already be familiar with it, but I just really the aesthetic and the values and the optimism and just it really resonates with me. Whereas it's essentially they have a token, so it's like a meme coin in addition to this channel. But as far as meme coins go, I own a few just like for fun. But this is the first one that I feel like the community like really meaningfully resonates for me. And another example I would give is DGen, where
Mm.
it wasn't as much about the community resonating with me. Like I had Yasik on the podcast, the creator of DGen, and he's a great guy, and I'm definitely rooting for him and rooting for DGen. But that was less about like the community resonating with me and like the values, and more about I thought Yasik was a really interesting builder and is a really interesting builder. And he's introduced this tipping mechanism, which has since been copied by like everyone else. And I thought he was the first to do that. And I thought that was really interesting. And so I like the technology there and the builder. But hires, I don't even really know actually who like was the first one to start it. It's not about the creator. It's not about the technology. It's about the culture and the brand and the values and the community. And so that's
Yeah.
been really cool to watch. And I think the third I can go off of that as a tangent is there's someone on Farcaster named Chick Bangs who has a new podcast called Hire.fm. And so obviously
Mhm.
she comes out of the hire community. But what's really interesting about the podcast is she's got this sort of format that I haven't really heard elsewhere, surprisingly, because it seems like it would be obvious, but she's mixing music and interviews
Mm.
like a traditional radio station might. And she's doing a great job with it. She's only put out a couple episodes so far, I think each of the last 2 weeks, but definitely excited to see what she does with that. I've listened to both episodes so far. So that's an underrated podcast, I would say, in the making. And then, there's a bunch of others. In general, I think I really prefer the up and coming podcast over the established. I think
Mm.
they tend to have more hunger. Each episode is like more important to them on average. They're really trying to make it, and that can result in more prep work and just better, more sincere, genuine conversation. Nothing against some of the big ones, like I said earlier. I think I mentioned Rogan. I have immense respect for him and what he's done. I think he's extraordinary at what he does, and maybe not every episode is amazing, but like he's extremely talented. There's some luck involved there, but really a lot of skill for him to have gotten to where he is as a
Mhm.
podcaster. And so nothing against some of the bigger shows, but I think in general, when I look up a guest who I want to listen to on a podcast, I start with some of the lesser known shows because you'll be surprised if you go out of your way to listen to podcasts you've never heard of. There's a lot of really interesting people out there recording great podcasts. So just a general endorsement for listening to lesser known podcasts is where I would wrap that up.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense because what Joe did when he started, I don't know when it was, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, is different from what these new podcasts, these new shows are doing, right? And this idea of mixing music, I think that's very smart. That's brilliant. There probably are some breaks in the episode and you can introduce music artists. So I think that's really smart. Thanks so much, Jake, for the recommendations and your time. This was amazing. I learned a lot from your experience doing your podcast, and the project Base Colors is really exciting. I think there will be a lot of synergies in the future. Yeah, looking forward to maybe in the future having you again in the show. And all the best, Jake.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I appreciate your
No,
patience
no
and your
worries.
questions, and it's been a lot of fun. And I always learn a lot by being asked very thoughtful questions as well. So I've learned a lot in the last hour or whatever it's been as well. And yeah, looking forward to keeping in touch.
Yeah, a pleasure, and no worries. I think it makes the conversation better because we had more time to go through some of the topics. So I think it was very interesting. Thanks so much, Jake, and take care.
Awesome. Thank you.